In this video, we're going to go through anatomy and physiology of both the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. So these are both glands that have a similar anatomical positioning, but they have pretty different physiology. So thyroid and parathyroid go together anatomy-wise, but don't try to link them together too much as far as their function, as far as physiology goes. They're pretty different. So really quick on the anatomy side, thyroid gland is pretty boring. It's a chunk of tissue that's wrapped around the trachea in sort of a butterfly-shaped pattern. So it has two lobes on it, connected by this little isthmus, just a strip of tissue holding it together in the center. The two sides don't do anything different from each other, and they just wrap around the back side of the trachea like this. On that posterior side, you see four little nodules of tissue that they have colored in blue here. Those are the parathyroid glands. And they happen to sit next to the thyroid, which is where they get their name. But again, not really connected function-wise. So as you're going through the endocrine system, don't get them mixed up. Be very clear whether you're talking about thyroid hormones, which are usually referred to by their names T3 and T4, versus parathyroid, which is just called parathyroid hormone. Very different function. Okay, so microscopically, this is what thyroid tissue looks like. So there's no parathyroid here. This is just thyroid follicles. And each of these structures that you see constitutes one follicle. Okay, the fluid in the center, this pinkish tissue, we call that colloid. So all of this would be colloid. This is where thyroid hormones T3 and T4 are produced and stored before they're excreted out into the blood when the gland needs to increase blood levels. The cells that are surrounding them, these, what they have called follicle cells, you'll hear them called follicular cells, they're doing the actual movement of T3 and T4 out of the colloid, and they're moving iodine into the colloid. So iodine is really critical for thyroid hormone function. The names T3 and T4 actually come from the fact that T3 has 3 iodine atoms and T4 has 4 of them. And so we'll see more of that in a minute. For right now, this is the setup for the anatomy. This picture is an illustration of a zoom in on one of those follicular cells. Okay, so from the previous slide, those cells that form a ring, right, surrounding an individual follicle, that is, right, an illustration of one of those follicular cells. And this would be colloid on the interior, right? This is blood that you're secreting back and forth between. And so when T3 and T4 are made, the biochemistry of it probably isn't a big deal here. Save that for an actual biochem class. But the names T3 and T4, the T is coming from the fact that you're using the amino acid tyrosine to make T3 and T4. And then again, the 3 and 4 come from the number of iodines used. And so we're basically taking tyrosine, right? Each of these is one tyrosine amino acid. And we're taking iodine atoms from the blood and pumping them or exocytosing them into the colloid. And so inside the colloid, you have this thyroglobulin molecule, which contains a lot of tyrosines. You combine that with iodine ions that are imported through this pendrin transporter, and they're then conjugated, right? Just meaning that the iodine atoms are linked to the tyrosine amino acids on that thyroglobulin protein. And at that point, we can put a little bit of a pause here. If blood levels of iodine are where they need to be, and you get enough tyrosine coming in, you can make as much T3 and T4 as you want, right? But if T3 and T4 levels in the blood are adequate, they're where we need to be, this process won't happen. And so from here on out, this is regulated, right? We want to decide how much of this T3 and T4 are we actually going to secrete into the blood. And so this process of moving the T3 and T4 out of the colloid into the blood, which is where they'll end up over here, that is regulated. It's not shown in this graphic, but that is regulated by the hormone TSH. So if you remember seeing in the pituitary and hypothalamus section, TSH is produced by the anterior pituitary. That is the hormone that tells these follicular cells, all right, it's time to take T3 and T4 out of the colloid, export them across these follicular cells and into the blood, right? And that is what we're seeing in this negative feedback loop. Okay, so there are going to be lots of examples of negative feedback in this class, covering all sorts of different kinds of physiological responses. This is a really straightforward example, right? So the way this works is, if your metabolic rate is a bit too low, right? Because thyroid hormones regulate basal metabolic rate, right? Body temperature, how many calories you're burning through, the level of consumption of nutrients that your cells are burning through at a given time. If you're on the low side of things, the hypothalamus is going to release TRH, that's thyrotropin releasing hormone, and TRH enters the anterior pituitary, right? This is the anterior pituitary, which secretes TSH, right? TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, so it makes perfect sense. That TSH has target cells in the thyroid gland. Those are the follicular cells that we were just looking at, and it stimulates them to make more T3 and T4 and release them out into the blood, right? When T3 and T4 enter the blood, remember, their whole job is to increase metabolic rate, which makes sense because our initial problem was metabolic rate was too low. So once T3 and T4 levels go up, that tells cells throughout the entire body to increase their energy consumption, right? So they're showing you mitochondria here because that's where aerobic respiration happens. You're burning through more carbs, more fat, body temp will go up. This makes sense why people that have hypothyroidism, low T3 and T4, will tend to be cold, tired, lethargic, and people that are hyperthyroid, that have too high of T3 and T4 levels, are the opposite. They're jittery, they have nervous energy, they get higher body temperature and feel overheated. And so we want to keep levels of this stable, right? Once T3 and T4 levels get back to where they need to be, and even if they get a little bit too high, you would expect negative feedback to kick in, right? Where we're going to inhibit the release of TRH and TSH. So the X's here are showing you low levels of those releasing hormones. Okay, so this makes sense of why if somebody gets blood work done in a clinical lab and it comes back and says your TSH levels are really high, that's actually a bad thing, because high TSH means your brain thinks that you don't have enough thyroid hormone, so it's releasing a lot of TSH to tell the thyroid, hey, you need to make more T3 and T4. If T3 and T4 levels are okay, or even on the high side, you would expect to see low TSH because the brain is saying, hey, everything's good, we have enough T3 and T4, no need to make more. And so these two, TSH and T3 and T4, should be opposite of each other, roughly. If one's high, you would expect the other to be low. All right. Now, the potential problem that can happen here, well, there are many of them. One of the potential problems that can happen is you can get a pituitary tumor that oversecretes TSH. If that happens, the thyroid gland doesn't know any better, and it'll just start churning out huge amounts of T3 and T4. That would be a case of hyperthyroidism. You can also imagine a defect where pituitary cells are not able to secrete TSH. That would cause hypothyroid and the inability to produce T3 and T4. Another way that things can go wrong is iodine deficiency. So it's not that big of a deal in most developed countries now, but in developing countries and historically, people had a hard time getting iodine in their diet sometimes. If that happens, you cannot make T3 and T4, right? Remember, this iodine becomes part of the T3 and T4 molecule, and iodine's an atom. You can't make it. You have to consume it through diet. And so if someone's iodine deficient, they can't make T3 and T4. The end result is T3 and T4 levels go way down, and your hypothalamus is going to dramatically ramp up TRH production, which will dramatically stimulate TSH released from the anterior pituitary. And when TSH levels get high enough, the thyroid takes that as a sign that something's going wrong, it's not able to produce enough hormone, and it starts growing. And the end result of that is something called a goiter, which this is an extreme case in the picture that's shown here. But a goiter is really just the thyroid gland growing because of very, very high TSH levels, thinking, hey, I can't make enough hormone, I must have to get larger because, remember, organs don't have intelligence, they don't make decisions. And so it's just responding to the chemical signals that it's getting. Really high TSH equals growth. And until this person eats some iodine, right, gets iodine back in their diet, this problem isn't going to be solved. Once they do get medical treatment, it will probably have to have surgery to remove some of the excess tissue. But only once iodine's back into the diet will things go back to normal. All right, so that's an overview of the thyroid gland. Parathyroid, remember, anatomically similar location. Parathyroid glands are little nodules of tissue on the posterior side of the thyroid. This is what it looks like under a microscope. But there's not really a whole lot of anything interesting going on here. You have just basically a lump of cells that's producing parathyroid hormone. And the thing that parathyroid hormone responds to is calcium levels in the blood. All right, so these cells in the parathyroid will release parathyroid hormone, or PTH, when blood calcium levels are too low. Okay, so we're going to walk through another negative feedback loop. This is an interesting one because it has multiple parts. So the stimulus is blood calcium levels falling. If blood calcium becomes too low, can cause major issues very quickly. Remember, calcium is needed by the nervous system to trigger neurotransmitter release. It's needed by muscles to create muscle contractions. And so the only way that you can get calcium in your blood is either from your diet or by borrowing some from bone tissue, right? Diet is obviously the ideal source, but nobody is constantly eating calcium. And so if blood levels start to drop a little bit, that's detected by the parathyroid gland, which releases PTH into the blood. That PTH has effects on several different target organs. One is bone tissue. If you remember from ANP1 information, osteoblasts are cells that build bone tissue. So we want to turn off osteoblasts. We want to turn on osteoclasts, right? Osteoclasts are cells that break down bone tissue. And if you start breaking apart bone tissue, the calcium is going to dissolve, diffuse away, and enter the blood, getting your blood levels back up. So thing one is make sure that we don't have an acute crisis here, get calcium levels back up by effectively borrowing some from the bone. The second effect is on the kidney. Your kidneys have to decide whether calcium gets returned back to the blood, or if there's excess calcium, it's going to have to be excreted in the urine. Right? If a person eats a very high calcium diet, you don't just keep storing it in your bones forever. It is going to get excreted through the urine. So if you have too much blood calcium excreted in the urine, if you don't have enough, which is the scenario we're in, PTH tells the kidney to reabsorb as much of that calcium as you possibly can back into the bloodstream, right? Because if you didn't do that, that would effectively mean that you're breaking down your bones with your osteoclasts and then excreting the calcium as urine and effectively peeing your own bones out, which sounds like a terrible idea. All right, so borrow some from your bones, make sure the kidneys are conserving as much as possible. And then the third effect is the kidney is actually the last step in the activation of vitamin D. And so it stimulates the intestines to absorb as much calcium as possible. They don't mention it in this graphic, but the mechanism for stimulating calcium absorption runs through vitamin D synthesis, right? Vitamin D production starts in your skin. You need sunlight exposure. There's an intermediate step in the liver, and then eventually the kidney finishes the job. And so the more PTH you have, the more vitamin D will get activated. That triggers calcium uptake to make sure that you're not eating calcium and having it just get lost through the GI tract. Okay. All right. I hope that was helpful, and keep an eye out for the next video. After this, we're going to move on to adrenal glands and then appetite regulation. So check the playlist, follow the videos in order, and subscribe to the channel to make sure that you get any updates or new videos that are added.